Salve et welcome ad Addicti Historia Mundi podcast. Ego Devon et odie com co-host Nick de Historia Italiae Medii Aevi Agere, de tempore indito Romae occidentalis lapsu, de aevo tenebrarum, et de renascentia Italiam et mundo modernum et initia. Incipiamus. Hello, and welcome to the World History Addicts Podcast, a show where we discuss history and global politics through a social and anthropological lens. My name is Devon, and today I'll be starting a trilogy of episodes on Italian history. In this first episode, I'll be talking with my co-host Nick about the history of medieval Italy from the fall of the Western Roman Empire through the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and the early modern age. Let's begin.
So, Devin, what was it like during the end of the fall of Rome, and what drove the collapse?
Well, in a single word, Nick, the answer was turmoil, chaos, turmoil, collapse, decay.
Oh.
That was the state of affairs back towards the end of Rome.
Okay.
In the 400s, I think that would be the 5th century. Rome had gone through a gradual process of decline. It had stopped expanding outwards. In fact, it had actually divided itself. The empire had gotten too large to be managed, so there was a Western Rome from Italy all the way to Greece, and then there was an Eastern Empire from the Balkans and Greece and Anatolia, stretching all the way out into into what's now the Middle East, like Iraq and the Levant.
Okay.
So across the empire, it was a very, very miserable state of affairs. There was corruption, there was inequality, there was barbarians coming in and invading and taking over.
Okay.
And keep in mind, this was a complete reversal of what Rome used to be, because before, the barbarians feared Rome. The Romans would march in, they would slaughter the barbarians, they would take their land, and they would Romanize the survivors so that the whoever they didn't kill eventually became Roman themselves.
Okay.
But now that was happening in reverse. It was the barbarians who were taking land from Rome. They were putting themselves up in power across what used to be the very heartland of Roman civilization. And I think increasingly many Romans were actually becoming more like the barbarians, because they were pretty clearly the winning side in this fight.
Real quick, are there some names of the people groups who were barbarians? I know we might touch on that a little later, but just for the listeners.
Yeah, there was the first big one, I would say, were probably the Visigoths. They were a nightmare for the Roman Empire, because they came in and they just kept winning battles against the Romans. They ended up taking over much of Spain, and they're actually the ancestors of many of today's modern Hispanics, including the people of Spain themselves.
All right.
They're also the Suebi, and they took over Portugal, and the Ostrogoths, who ended up taking, I think, much of southern France, southern Germany, and parts of northern Italy.
Yeah.
And of course, you have the Vandals, whose name actually leads to the modern word vandalism.
Did not know that.
They were so notorious for destroying everything and pillaging and looting. Yeah, they actually ended up taking over the North African provinces of the Roman Empire, which weirdly enough means that many North Africans today are actually the descendants of German barbarians.
Okay.
Definitely.
Wow, it's really interesting, because you always hear the term barbarians, right? And when talking about the end of Rome, but it almost seems like, was there some kind of political motivation behind that? Is there some kind of political motivation behind that word? Like, were they actually just like less intelligent people groups, right? Or was that kind of more of like a way that they were classified compared to Romans? Like, were Romans more quote unquote sophisticated than them?
Well, the interesting thing is, many of them were definitely much less advanced. They didn't have large cities. They didn't have the same type of political system where there's like a clear set of checks and balances and representative government, or large-scale military formations, because that's what Rome excelled at. They had a very well-organized military where they had professional soldiers and state funding for the army, and they had these really seasoned commanders who could send out thousands and thousands of Roman soldiers to wreak havoc across their enemies. But at the same time, other civilizations, like the Persians, were also considered barbarians.
Oh, okay.
I mean, even for a time, the Romans themselves were actually considered barbarians by the Greeks, because at that point, the Greeks were the civilized ones. And it was only later that the Romans proved themselves and ended up adopting much of Greek culture, with their own Roman spin on it, of course. But they eventually became civilized, too. But they also viewed other groups like the Celts, other Europeans, as barbarians.
Yeah.
Even though the Celts also had a good amount of cities and settlements too.
So, so we have our people coming in and kind of claiming land that once belonged to Rome. It's almost like a deterioration process. But I imagine that this also does point to like the decline of some infrastructure, or like was there also other things going on?
Yeah, because one of Rome's great selling points is that their public infrastructure was top notch. They had these aqueducts, which meant that people could have running water in their cities. That actually wouldn't show up until much later in history after the fall of Rome. The road systems were exquisite. You could just and they were safe too, because you could just walk down the road and you could carry a mule or a horse and just travel across Europe, and you would be completely safe because the Romans provided security for travelers going through the empire.
Wow.
But as the Roman Empire starts to decay, well, the aqueduct stops and the sewer stops supplying clean water and a clean way to dispose of waste. There's the roads just become much more dangerous, and your chance of just being attacked by bandits just skyrocket as the administration starts to decline.
Okay. So this all kind of the end of Rome. It all points right to the end of the classical era. I think that's what we'd refer to it as, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the beginning of a new era, the Middle Ages, right? AKA the medieval period.
Medieval age.
A lot of nerd stuff there. But in that light, what are some of the major events of the Middle Ages, right? And like, can you kind of describe kind of that whole era? I know that's a really big question, but like, can you give us some big talking points about that?
Yes. So the year that the Roman Empire officially ends is 476 AD, and that is when the barbarian king Odoacer takes power in Italy itself, including in the city of Rome, and he declares that there is no more Roman Empire.
Oh.
So that is, in effect, the end of the classical era and the beginning of the medieval era.
Okay.
Yeah. But, of course, he doesn't hold on to it. He's actually murdered by a rival named Theodoric, and then Theodoric himself loses it to another group of Germans called the Ostrogoths. But even after that, they're not able to hold on to Rome either. And then the Eastern Romans, also known as the Byzantines at this point, they're Greeks who adopted the Roman identity, and remained standing after the fall of Western Rome, because the conditions were very different out in the East. They were living in Anatolia, I think, mainly.
Okay.
So in a weird sense, they're almost like a Middle Eastern Greek empire that still held on to the Roman legacy. But they were still very powerful, and they could actually project power all the way from the Middle East back into Rome itself. So they actually controlled Italy for a while.
Okay.
And at the same time, there were other invasions going on, because the Roman Empire collapsed in 476, but less than 2 years later, there was a new religion on the scene. That was Islam. It began in the Arabian Peninsula and then rapidly spread from Arabia into the rest of the Levant, into Anatolia, and into the Mediterranean, across North Africa.
Yeah.
And several large islands in the Mediterranean, including Malta and also Sicily, which is at that point had actually been part of Rome, was taken over by the Muslims. They ruled there for a while. And the other major power, I think, in the Mediterranean up into the High Middle Ages was the Normans.
Okay.
The Normans were originally Vikings, but they settled in France and made a deal with the French king that they could own land if they stopped raiding the French. But they kept raiding others instead. In fact, they were the ones who actually invaded into England and took over from the Anglo-Saxons.
Okay.
They're actually, I believe, still the ruling class of England even today.
Wait,
you can actually trace the ancestry of the Normans from all the way back in the year 1066 to many like modern high-ranking rulers within the British Isles.
That's very interesting. That could almost lead to some conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah, actually, in a way.
Okay, so this kind of does the fall of Rome officially, as you said, 476 AD, right?
Yeah.
And sorry, does this what's the Holy Roman Empire? What like is that related to this? Is that during this time, or is that different?
Yeah. One confusing thing in this era is that there's the Roman Empire, and there's the Western Roman Empire. There's the Eastern Roman Empire, who we now call the Byzantines, though they never actually used that term during the time they were actually around. But then there's a third Rome. There's the Holy Roman Empire, which is actually what's modern Germany and parts of France, too.
Okay.
Back in the day, it was a mess of all these different kingdoms and city-states and duchies and some areas that were actually run by the church itself. Like I believe they're called like bishoprics and abbacies. Like a bishop would actually control entire like a small country.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, it was a very different kind of setup from pretty much anything else that exists today. I suppose maybe the closest thing you could get to it today would be maybe what's going on in, say, Iraq today, because there actually are areas that are controlled by or were controlled by the Islamic State.
Okay.
And I don't know, maybe in some parts of India, just due to the autonomy, you could kind of maybe draw a comparison to between the Holy Roman Empire and like modern India.
Okay.
If America starts breaking down, I suppose you could kind of also draw a comparison to like America if like different states had a high degree of autonomy underneath the federal government.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but there's also the investiture controversy, which was, I suppose, probably the big question of the Holy Roman Empire. Should the Holy Roman Emperor be more powerful than the Pope? And even they couldn't figure that question.
That was called the investiture controversy?
Yes, that was the conflict between multiple Holy Roman Emperors and multiple popes.
Oh wow!
Because in some cases the popes had the upper hand because they could just excommunicate the emperor. In one case, I believe it was the Holy Roman Emperor. What was his name? I think it was Otto or Leo. Yeah, he actually had to dress himself in rags like a peasant, and he had to walk barefoot to the papacy and wait outside the gates of the Pope's castle and beg for his kingdom back, because that was the power that the Catholic Church had at that point in time. They actually had the power to make or break emperors.
That does kind of like, when I think of medieval imagery, I think of like really tall churches and cathedrals and Catholic Church imagery and crosses, you know. That does make kind of some sense that during after the fall of Rome, during the medieval times, you do have the rise of the power of the church almost. And because there's also the Crusades, right? There's also the Crusades during the Middle Ages. Like, are those related?
Yes, because the power of the Catholic Church eventually comes into conflict with Muslim power in the Middle East, and what was then Israel and the Holy Land.
Okay.
The Seljuks, who are this other, they actually weren't Arabs or Persians, because as Islam spread, it went far beyond the Middle East to Central Asia, and to other areas of the area kind of between the Far East of like China and Japan, and the Western world of like, say, Germany, France, and Italy. They eventually converted to Islam because originally the Turks were actually very similar to the Mongols. They were a nomadic people living out on the steppes of Eurasia. But eventually they took over. They actually became more powerful than the Arabs and the Persians who had converted them in the first place, and they became much more aggressive and started invading westwards towards Christian lands.
Okay.
And they actually began blocking Christian pilgrims from going to the Holy Land, which led to an uproar across Europe, and that's one of the reasons why they declared the Crusades.
Okay.
However, Christendom wasn't actually united during this point, because there was still a Western Catholic Church and a Eastern Orthodox Church, because by 1054 there was a schism and the two sides split. There were all these disagreements, like the Easterners refused to recognize the Pope as God's representative on earth.
Okay.
And there were also just all these issues with rights, like in the... I don't mean like rights as in like human rights. I mean as in their customs, like the Latin like Western Church.
Like RITE?
RITE, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because in the West, they had all these icons, like all these statues of Jesus and stained glass windows that showed biblical scenes and figures.
Yeah.
But in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they didn't like icons, so they actually destroyed images of Jesus and other people.
Wow.
And replaced them with just symbols or other types of artwork.
Is that all under the umbrella of Catholicism?
Not actually, no, because Catholicism is in the West, the Orthodox are in the East. So
okay.
the East is like Greece, Eastern Europe, the Levant, because at that point there were still many Christians living in the Middle East.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Islam was still fairly new to the area, so they hadn't become the majority just yet.
Okay.
And there's also the Venetians, because they were they were what you would call a merchant republic. The Venetians were originally a bunch of refugees from northern Italy who actually fled into the lagoons of the Adriatic, because another Germanic group called the Lombards were conquering into Italy, And to escape them, they actually decide to flee out onto these islands in the marshes.
Okay, so hold on. So the Venetians, they were was that a city state that kind of sprung up after Rome, or why were they fleeing those people? I guess to answer that's I'm just curious.
Well, the Lombards were just very warlike, and they were just looting and destroying everything as they were coming down south from, I think that was from what's southern Germany today.
Okay.
So because of that, they fled onto the islands, and from there they actually began creating their own, in a way, their own country in the middle of the sea. They got wood, and then they like drove into the ground, and over time it actually began to petrify and turn into stone.
Oh,
And on that, they built it up more and more, and because they had to be good at sailing to even reach their home in the first place, they eventually became masters of naval craft.
okay.
And that becomes very important later because eventually the Venetians are the ones who are transporting crusaders from Europe into the Holy Land.
Oh, so that's okay. I was wondering how that related. So they're bringing crusaders over to the Holy Land, and then
But the thing is, they're not really doing this out of any kind of ideology or because they're helping their fellow Christians. They're mostly doing this for money.
Okay.
And you can tell this because the Venetians are also the ones who actually hire the Crusaders to attack the Eastern Christians in Constantinople in 1204, which they do, and they absolutely ransack the city, and they destroy it. And in a way, Constantinople and the Eastern Romans never really recover from this kind of betrayal from the West. And because of that, they themselves end up being conquered a few centuries later by the Ottoman Turks, another Turkic dynasty, but one that's, I believe, a bit less warlike and a bit more pragmatic in the way that they govern.
Okay, now the because like I feel like you can't talk about the medieval period without talking about the Black Death, right? Now
that's a very big event.
Where does that tie in with all this?
Well, the Black Death is coming towards the end of the Middle Ages. I think around like the late Middle Ages. That happens in 1350. The Black Death actually didn't start anywhere in Europe. It actually began all the way out in China, and I think even in Central Asia, around like say Western Mongolia or Kyrgyzstan.
Okay,
there are these animals called marmots, and they actually they carry the plague on them.
Okay.
And because of the Silk Road and because it's so interconnected, the plague spreads from Central Asia and China into the Middle East, and from the Middle East all the way out into Europe.
Oh, wow.
There's actually this trading city in I think what's now Ukraine, and the Venetians are trading there, but the Mongols are laying siege to this city by like launching dead plague victims into the city to spread it. So, because bio warfare was actually a thing even back then, and it works too.
What warfare?
Bio warfare.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you
warfare.
wouldn't think that seems like something that's only World War I and up. Like, but launching dead bodies into a city definitely seems like a way to get some nasty stuff going.
Oh yeah. Because it completely works because not only does it spread to the city, it also spreads to the Venetians who are trading in the city, and they flee the city after all these dead bodies start raining from the skies. And,
oh my gosh.
But they end up taking the plague with them across through the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, which is that's like this strip of water in what's now Turkey that connects the Black Sea just south of Ukraine to the Mediterranean.
Okay.
So they sail through that, and then they go back to Italy, and they carry the plague with them, and that starts the Black Plague in Europe. Okay,
so the Venetians brought the plague to Europe from where? I'm trying to visualize this on a map.
From Ukraine.
So from like far Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, from Eastern Europe into the Mediterranean, and from there into Europe, the plague spreads, and it kills, I think, roughly a third of Europe.
Oh my
It kills
gosh.
a crazy number of people.
Yeah. So that, I mean, I would imagine that had obviously very drastic effects on society, right?
Yes, the population decreases so drastic that it doesn't rebound up until I think about like the 1700s or even 1800. It's a crazy amount of death that takes place.
But didn't when we were discussing this previously, didn't you say that it also gave the peasants more bargaining power in terms of their labor?
Yeah, because the peasants, or just the average person across Europe at this point, was a serf. They live on lands that are owned by a lord, and they have to work the lands. They have to give up their crops to the lord, a certain percentage of their crops to the lord. they also have to fight wars for their lord. If like the lord is getting into a fight with a neighboring
That sucks.
another noble or something, they have to rally the peasants, and they take up arms and fight for the lord.
Okay.
And but if so many of them are dead, then you can't just expend them. You can't simply just order them around, because now they have bargaining power.
Wow. So how did that manifest in them bettering conditions for themselves after the plague, or where did that kind of go?
Yeah, it isn't equal throughout Europe, because some areas are much more drastically affected by the plague than others, and I believe in some of the areas the social structure was a bit more entrenched, like in Europe, so it didn't have as strong as an effect as it would later in, like, say, Northern Europe, because that's where the later Protestant Reformation begins. That's where many other that's where the scientific revolutions begin later in history.
Yeah.
But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. We're talking about the Middle Ages, not the modern era.
Well, but I mean, like, that does point, because, like, I mean, the plague happens, many people die, but doesn't the plague kind of signify the end of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, right? And doesn't that kind of point towards the Renaissance?
Yes, it's happening, I would say, around the same time as the Renaissance. I believe the Renaissance begins around the year 1400. So, yeah, about 50 years after the Black Plague, the Renaissance begins, and that I would say the Renaissance is also pretty much the end of the Dark Ages. It
Okay.
is the beginning of when more records are being kept in Europe, and we know much more about what Europe looked like in that era. The Dark Ages are really something of a misnomer, because whenever someone uses the term the Dark Ages, they think of, like, some dark fantasy type of.
That's exactly what I think of, dragons and, like, sorcery.
Like, knights, just all knights and barbarians just running around with, like, giant blood-soaked swords, just, like, fucking each other up, and, like, everyone is just, like, living in these shacks, and there's, like, dead bodies everywhere, and it's just gross, and everyone is, like, are religious fanatics who just, like, nail each other to crosses for no reason. That, I think, is an exaggeration. It certainly wasn't a fun time to be around at, like, say, the fall of Rome, but conditions were improving.
Okay.
Because as the barbarian kingdoms fought each other, they also consolidated power, and because of that, eventually it became safer to travel across Europe.
Did they kind of manifest in newer city-states in Europe, or I'm sorry, in Italy?
Yes, they did. During the Renaissance, the main drivers of the Renaissance were different Italian city-states. So the Venetians being probably the strongest out of all of them. They're also the most active in their maritime affairs. But there's also the Republic of Genoa, and there are also the Florentines. There's also Milan. And, of course, there's also the city of Rome itself, which becomes part of the Papal States, which is where the Pope lives. What I should actually get into is the fall of Constantinople and how gunpowder warfare played a major role in both accelerating the end of Rome, but also bringing the modern era.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So on that note, like, right, we've basically reached the end of the Middle Ages, the plague, the Renaissance. I guess to kind of tie that all up, like, how does the medieval era end, right? And I guess in Italy and in Europe as a whole, how does that all come to an end?
Yeah, so I suppose you could also argue that the Middle Ages really ends with a bang, because gunpowder, which originally began in China but started moving its way westward with the expansion of the Mongols.
Yeah.
Gunpowder was invented in China, but from what I've read about it, cannons first really began being used in the Middle East, and then handheld firearms first appeared in Europe.
Okay.
And this is around, I would say, like maybe the late 1300s, early 1400s. It's also one of the reasons why Constantinople was actually finally breached and taken by the Ottoman Empire, because they just built these gigantic cannons, like arguably I think larger than any other siege weapon that had been built up till that point.
Okay.
And they just bombarded the city, and they crushed the walls, and they surged in that way. That's how they were able to defeat them. But that also is why the Renaissance picked up, because by destroying the last remnants of the Eastern Romans, they opened up all these avenues for lost artworks and knowledge from pre-collapse Rome to seep back into Western Europe.
Oh, okay.
And that also and that makes it more possible for all these great artworks that the whole period is known for to start being made, because they're being inspired by all the knowledge that was lost during the collapse of Rome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, like it. When I think of the Renaissance, I think of art mainly, and like sculptures, and also, I don't know, like an awakening of like ideas, right? Did it also spill into, like, I guess, political ideas as well, or was it solely like an artistic kind of revolution?
I would say that's mostly known for the artwork, but it also did affect other forms because it affected the humanities too. It affected the very concept of humanism.
Oh, okay.
As a kind of way of thinking, where that and you can see that in the artwork because before, like say the late or like the Dark Ages, like the early Middle Ages, before like say up until the Vikings, artwork was really crude.
Okay.
Roman artwork was exquisite. There was all these statues, and there's the buildings, and I'm not sure if the Romans really did much in the way of paintings, but regardless, their artistic achievements were very well known.
Okay.
The early Middle Ages, not so much. There's a gradual decline of that. It seems most of the artwork in the era was very crude and mostly had to do with biblical stories and a devotion to God, because people were, I believe, much more fanatical during that point in time, just because they didn't have much else to cling on to. Their civilization had basically collapsed.
Man.
But then, as things become more stable, they can focus more on higher art, fine arts.
Yeah.
And where you get sculptors like Michelangelo's David statue, which just like shows the details, like David's face and like the muscles and like the sword that he uses, and you can see just the sheer shift in mindset throughout much of Europe at that point.
A little parentheses, like you mentioned that after the fall of Rome, the art takes a turn to be a lot more crude and less advanced and more so just very strictly like religious and kind of fanatical. It almost makes me wonder, like if America were to go and become just some like theocracy Christian nation afterwards, right, run by fanatics, it almost seems like the same thing would happen. Honestly, it's really scary.
That's probably true, because these are the same people who actually do want a huge amount of censorship on like freedom of speech.
Yeah.
I imagine that they would probably view most of our modern art as degenerate and try to get it banned in some way.
Oh no, those are like talking points. Those are actual talking points. But regardless, I don't want to get into that whole tangent. But that was a little similarity that I saw. Anyways.
And I mean, much of that I would assume was probably also because the new people in charge were effectively warlords, and they don't have the same appreciation of art that the later intellectuals of the Renaissance had. Mm-hmm. So that's probably a reason too.
Okay. So medieval era is ending, right? The Renaissance is going on. The Black Death kills off a lot of people. I guess like more so like I'm sorry. We also mentioned the technological advancements of gunpowder and, like you said,
that also leads to the decline of the knight, because during the Middle Ages, the premier warrior in Europe is the knight, the fully armored nobility on a horse with some of the best training that money can buy at the time. They're trained from a very young age to be the best in their craft, which is killing people on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. But suddenly that starts to change, because suddenly a peasant with an early gun can shoot a knight off a horse. Formations of musketeers can suddenly neutralize armored cavalry, and that starts to shift power away from the nobility to the masses. But it also eventually shifts into like the centralization of power, because if you're the king and you own all these gunpowder troops and siege weapons like cannons, you can pretty much crush the nobles. Wow. And going down the line, this eventually leads to the absolute monarchs of the early modern era, like King Louis.
Yeah. Well, on that note, you kind of said that the modern era begins with a bang, and I guess the modern era, people are going to have to wait to hear all about the modern era. But I guess overall, to kind of put a bow on all this, right? Like to package it nicely, like what lessons can we learn from the early medieval history of Italy?
Well, the first big lesson we can learn, especially from the fall of Rome, is that no system lasts forever. The Romans once believed that they would inherit the world and that they would become the one true universal empire, but that ended up not being the case. Rome fell just like every other empire had before them. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was also the path to rebirth, because the barbarians who destroyed Rome were also the ancestors of the people who built up modern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So and collapse does lead to renewal. It was the Black Death that opened the way to an entirely new mercantile class that revolutionized what Europe would become.
Yeah.
And also, when one door closes, many other doors end up opening up at the same time. Because the Ottomans, who took down the Eastern Romans, blocked off trade going into the Middle East, and that eventually opened up possibilities for new explorers sailing around Africa to get to the spice trades and China and India, but also Columbus sailing west across the Atlantic to discover 2 new continents that no one in Europe seems to know about at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of on that note, it kind of like does point to what the kind of some of the conclusions we came on the last episode, where even if it is the cataclysmic fall of an empire, right? Like, and it feels like you're at the end of history, you're really not. The page does turn and it does begin and it moves on. Even if we won't be there to see it, it does move on.
Yeah, the good times unfortunately don't last, but the good news is neither do the bad times.
Dude, that's inspiring. Well, thanks, Devin. All right. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the next episode.